The Battle of Blair Mountain is perhaps one of the most important, yet rarely taught about moments in contemporary American history. It started during the First World War. When it kicked off in 1914, the U.S. began to heavily ramp up already profitable exports and increase production of war material. By the time we joined the war in 1917, wartime production and a generous economic boom had ballooned union and worker power. Following the end of the war in 1918, the government began to step back from its wartime economic policy, which allowed companies to seize the opportunity and crack down on those pesky unions. There were around 3,000 union strikes that year. In West Virginia, a veritable breadbasket of coal mining companies had already established a massive base of economic and political sway, due in part to the isolated and fiercely individualist culture of the small mining towns that were spread across the state. The majority of these towns were company towns, whose massive cost-cutting measures had an immense effect on the quality of life of the workers and their families. Moreover, many of these workers were forced into contracts that strictly forbade them from joining any sort of union, and by this time, violence was considered the typical response to any labor disputes. Much of this violence was conducted by the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, who had more than made a name for themselves as the premier union busters in the country, actively recruiting former police, soldiers, criminals, and mine workers to their ranks. Armed skirmishes between strikers and strike breakers intensified around this time, culminating in the governor of West Virginia making a desperate plea for aid from President Warren Harding. After being denied help from the federal government on the determination that the fighting was purely a state-level issue, the governor saw fit to raise a militia comprised of police, civilian volunteers, and Baldwin-Felts agents. As if all this wasn't bad enough, tensions came to a boiling point in August of 1921 when Sid Hatfield, an extremely pro-union and anti-corporate Mingo County police chief, was ambushed by Baldwin-Felts agents and shot to death in front of his wife on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse, intending to attend trial over bogus charges of conspiracy. His martyrdom at the hands of corporate thugs sent the striking miners into a fury. As many as 5,000 of them, many arriving armed, mobilized to march at a rally in Charleston, West Virginia. Following intense disorganization, 2 vital union organizers stepped down out of sheer frustration, and the new power vacuum was filled with more radical individuals. Company storehouses were broken into and raided for weapons and supplies, including rifles and machine guns. The ralliers, all 9,000 of them at this point, formed up to march on Mingo County, which required them to travel through corporate-aligned Logan County, whose sheriff was a notorious anti-union thug. In preparation, the sheriff organized a sizable force, comprised mostly of the governor's new militia, 3,000 anti-union volunteers, among them cops, civilians, and Baldwin-Felts gunmen, established fortifications, trenches, and machine gun nests across the Spruce Fork Ridge. They also had with them 3 privately owned aircraft modified to be able to drop homemade gas and nail bombs. Wanting to avoid needless bloodshed, President Harding sent in U.S. Army General Harry Banholtz to investigate the situation. His ultimatum was delivered to the former organizers of the Union force, and its terms were simple: vacate the area, or the army will be forced to obliterate them. Many of the miners, most of whom were themselves veterans of the Great War, were pretty firmly swayed by this, believing that their fight was against the negligence of the state and not wanting to actually bring harm to the federal government. Many of them willingly complied and began to depart to a town nearby to wait for a provided train to bring them home. Unsurprisingly, it got worse. A horrifically mistimed police raid on this town was ambushed on the way there, which resulted in a firefight. And from this, rumors began to spread that during this firefight, the police shot women and children. This rumor galvanized the formerly compliant miners, and most of them returned straight to their frontline encampments and assumed their final positions. It was at this point the governor sent one last desperate plea to D.C. Harding delivered his own personal ultimatum on the 30th of August. leave within 48 hours, or face the army. Later that evening, a small splinter party of a minor night patrol came across and then shot at 3 drunk deputies, which resulted in the deaths of 1 minor and 2 of the deputies. That specific incident ignited what was, at the time, the bloodiest instance of armed conflict in the nation since the Civil War. Attempts by the miners to flank anti-Union strongpoints in the valley were repelled by rifle and machine gun fire. Those private planes I mentioned earlier, they came to play here, missing their bombing runs entirely. The Unionists, though superior in numbers, lacked unity and a coherent strategy, made very few gains. Finally, on the 1st of September, with the miners exhausted and anti-Unionists running low on ammunition, the final ultimatum expired. The arrival of the U.S. Army was heralded by Army Air Corps planes roaring over Blair Mountain. The miners retreated to their encampment, and the Army managed to negotiate a ceasefire and wrested control of the area. The battle itself is interesting for a few reasons. Although over 1 million rounds were fired in anger, casualties numbered as few as 100 men. Additionally, Blair Mountain also marked what seems to have been the second time U.S. citizens were bombed by aircraft on U.S. soil, which previously had happened just a few months prior, when privately owned aircraft dropped homemade shrapnel and incendiary bombs on African American citizens in Tulsa during the destruction of Black Wall Street. The majority of the miners did consider Blair to be a victory. General Banholtz's opinion of the situation at large had shifted the blame towards the state and the mine owners, with their final retaliation being to accuse the striking miners of having links to the international socialist movement, which DC investigated and promptly threw out. United Mine Workers of America then quickly faced a death spiral. Legal costs had drained them dry, and dropping demand for coal mixed with rapidly declining public support resulted in the loss of some 49,000 union members, leaving just 600 men to pick up the pieces. It's sad to see that incidents like Blair and Tulsa are rarely, if ever, discussed in education and in American society in general. This monumental effort taken to just ignore 2 extremely influential and pivotal events in early 20th century American history is frankly absurd and astounding. It only leaves me wondering, why? Perhaps the answer lies in corporate interests. There are plenty of reasons to not want people to be aware of the gross injustices that the state and corporations perpetrated and continue to perpetrate. Hell, strike breaking and union busting never ended with Blair. Companies just look towards more covert approaches. Even the union busters of those days are still around. Though Baldwin Felts dissolved around the late 30s, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, for example, was purchased by a Swedish private security conglomerate, Securitas AB, in 1999. That's right, they're still around. Hell, their most recent action was less than 3 months ago, breaking into the home of a Magic the Gathering YouTuber, pointing rifles at him and his wife, and demanding that he return to them stolen property. This stolen property was Magic the Gathering cards from a new set that the YouTuber had received early on complete and total accident. Wizards of the Coast, a subsidiary of Hasbro, one of the largest toy and mixed media corporations on the planet, hired the Pinkertons in 2023 to take cardboard game cards back at gunpoint. It seems to me that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Thank you for listening.